Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning. I think we've got people joining from all over the world for this webinar, which is brilliant. The real purpose behind this session is to discuss the findings from a recent survey that we commissioned to understand more about how ready and how prepared European timber importers are for incoming deforestation regulations, so particularly EUDR, and their attitudes towards traceability solutions. Now, I'm really aware that there are a lot of people joining who come from organizations and backgrounds that are broader than timber and wood products. They may relate to different commodities altogether, but I think that's still very valuable for today. We look forward to hearing from you because the regulation does touch, of course, more than just timber. So this should hopefully be quite general. We are lucky enough to be joined by two brilliant partners. So it's 3 organizations co-presenting this particular webinar. We've got Chloe from Preferred by Nature. We have Ollie from the Zoological Society of London SPOTT, and we have David Coleman from IOV42. And each of them will introduce themselves shortly as we get into the content. In terms of what we want to cover, we're going to keep the introduction quite brief and do 2 deep dives. And this is where we hope to really encourage the discussion. So we'll look at preparedness and awareness around EUDR, and then we'll do a second deep dive looking at attitudes towards traceability. How are people feeling about traceability solutions generally? We've dedicated the last third of the entire webinar to Q&A. We've already had quite a lot of questions come in advance, which is fantastic. So we'll be answering those throughout. And if you want to pose questions, please use the chat function at the bottom right of the screen where it says, say something nice. And we will answer those questions at the very end of the webinar, or as much of them as we can. So I've already mentioned that we want to encourage as much discourse as possible. We're recording the webinar, so please be aware of that. If you're typing questions, your name might come up, but I don't think anyone apart from the panelists are on camera. And then if for whatever reason you need to rejoin the webinar, maybe your Wi-Fi drops, please re-enter using the link shared in an email that would have come through from Crowdcast. And I can see Ollie is just kindly demonstrating that and rejoining us live as we speak. So as a quick reminder and a background to the report, which some of you will have read, some of you might not, we really wanted to put ourselves in the shoes of the industry and understand how importers in particular based in Europe were feeling around incoming regulation. So we surveyed over 250 importers recently, just a couple of months ago in August. And the survey focused on 5 countries in particular: Austria, Belgium, Italy, France, and the UK. And there were a minimum of 50 respondents from each country. So the answers are very well balanced. No one country has a bigger share of voice in this than another. And we asked about 10 different questions. We're only going to touch upon 1 or 2 of them today. So without further ado, I think our first deep dive, and I'm just going to check if I can get Ollie back in here. Let's see if he's rejoining. Here he is. Like magic. Hi. I was just saying thank you very much, Ollie, for demonstrating what happens if we have a bad Wi-Fi and we drop off the webinar. So you've demonstrated that perfectly. Thank you very much. Where we are is it would be really helpful before going into the findings of the report, maybe to hear a couple of thoughts from each of the partners in here, just sharing a bit of a personal introduction, background as to why you're on the call and what your organization does. So if I can start with you, Chloe.
Sure, if I can manage to unmute. Can you confirm that you hear me well? Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Chloe from Preferred by Nature. Just a quick few words on who we are. We're a not-for-profit international organization. We're a mission-based organization, so we work around improving land management and business practices all over the world, on timber, but on also all the other forest-related commodities. And we have different kinds of activities. So some of you might know us through our certification activities. So we are certifiers of systems like FSC or PEFC or other agricultural commodities. But we also have donor-funded projects all over the world. We also do tailored services for companies who are setting up and implementing responsible sourcing programs and practices. And we also have let's say a last pillar around trainings. So I think that covers all our activities. And so of course we've been working with companies a lot from the start of the EUDR, so on timber legality. So we have kind of this understanding of the evolution of all the business practices that have happened in the last decade. And we're following up very closely on the upcoming changes with this deforestation regulation. And I'm sitting in France.
Lovely, thank you, Chloe. Ollie, would you mind doing a quick introduction on behalf of yourself and SPOTT, please?
Sure. Oliver Cupit here. I manage our sustainable business and finance team at ZSL. So ZSL is an organisation that's been around since the 1800s. We're a charity based in the UK with a focus on biodiversity conservation. So we have field conservation programs all around the world, with offices in Thailand, in Cameroon, in the Philippines, focused on conserving different species. But we also look at ecosystem level conservation and trying to stop deforestation and habitat loss. And that's really where most of my work focuses on, engaging with the palm oil sector, the timber sector, and the natural rubber sector to avoid deforestation and habitat loss. And we have been involved with companies actually supporting on understanding the new regulation. We have inputted to the stakeholder consultations on the development of the regulation themselves directly, the EU bodies, and also through other work that we do that's donor funded. We have our SPOTT project, which actually evaluates companies in those palm oil, timber, and rubber sectors on their ESG performance. So how transparent are companies being already, and how can that be used as part of due diligence for companies looking to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains?
Fab, thank you. Last but not least, David Coleman.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name's David. I'm head of product here at IOV42. IOV42 is a technology company, predominantly and more certainly historically in the distributed ledger space, or blockchain, as some of you may know it. But what we're really about, having developed a distributed ledger technology that is looking for a problem is pretty useless. We found a problem, and that is in the traceability space. Helping with sustainability, helping with circular economy, all these kind of use cases. And timber has been a real focus for us as a company over the past year or so, and exciting to be able to bring a technology to be able to help with the likes of certification and traceability, all these kind of issues that we're going to be talking about today. So it's great to be a part of this conversation.
Wonderful. Before diving into the findings, Ollie, would you be able to share just a few words or thoughts about where we currently are with the EUDR regulation? Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's, I guess, going to be important, because a lot of the issues that people are grappling with and that we'll cover today are not quite finally decided, and that's because the legislation was launched back in November 2021 by the EU Commission, and it's since that time been going through a number of revisions. So there was a revision by the EU Council in June 2022, and then that's later been reviewed and revised, and a new proposal put forward by the EU Parliament in September 22. Now we're at the stage where those three EU bodies, the Commission, the Council and the Parliament, are now basically hashing it out between their competing proposal text and trying to come to a resolution on some of the detail that's in there. So the Parliament proposal that came out recently saw an increased focus on human rights, increasing the product scope to include soya and rubber and maize, in addition to timber, palm oil, and those which were initially included. It's also recommended to expand the scope to include financial institutions located within the EU that are funding some of the soft commodity sectors that are producing forest risk commodities. I think one of the things that hasn't changed throughout is the requirement around geolocation of plots where people are sourcing from, where organizations are sourcing from. So I think this is potentially the most troubling aspects that we'll go into a bit later, and what people are most concerned about. But I think from everything we've seen, that doesn't seem to have changed much in the three versions that have come out so far. So we're fairly confident that that geolocation requirement will stay in the final text, whilst other things may change.
Lovely, thanks so much. And if anyone does have questions, please just ask. Like I said, we want to make this useful for everyone involved. Without further ado, I will just share a very high level breakdown of the results to the question that we asked around how prepared or aware are you of incoming deforestation regulation. So this was going to those European-based timber importers, and roughly one quarter, 26.2% in the top right, said that they were fully prepared for this regulation. More, 37% said that they were somewhat prepared. Another quarter said that they hadn't yet started preparing. 8% said we need help knowing how this regulation will impact us as a business and how it might look. And just under 3% said that they weren't aware of the regulation here. So again, back to you, perhaps, Ollie. Does anything jump out at you here? Are you surprised by any of the data?
Yeah, I suppose the 26% of respondents only feeling fully prepared. Perhaps not. It's not surprising because of those issues that I just raised, that the final text isn't ready yet and hasn't been published, and we'll probably see that Q1 next year at the earliest, I would expect. So there are a number of aspects that are yet to be decided, including, where the cutoff date for deforestation is going to be, and other aspects. But I would have potentially expected the survey of timber sector to have shown a slightly more improved level of preparedness, because we've had the EU timber regulation in place. And I think that probably reflects the fact that this is changing the EUDR significantly, because we're going beyond just timber legality, and deforestation monitoring is perhaps something that is not something that a lot of organizations have been doing so far. They've been relying on supply chain mapping, on document collection, but not necessarily looking at that land use change using satellite monitoring tools, for example, and in a lot of cases not having full traceability to a particular plot level. I think that is interesting, because if that's how the timber sector is feeling, and I've heard this from other sectors like the natural rubber sector, I think there's a lot more unease in commodities that have not had the lessons learned from the EUDR like the timber sector has. So I would expect that the feeling of preparedness will be even lower in some of those commodity sectors that are potentially have more complex supply chains and that haven't been exposed to regulation like the EUDR for the past however many years. So
if you're joining this feeling anxious that you're not fully prepared, you're not alone, and there are lots of organisations who are in exactly the same boat as you, and organisations as well who are here to help. Behind these data points is, of course, some variance from a country level. So we had some countries and some size of organisations feeling more prepared than others. So maybe a question for you, Chloe. Why do you think it is that some organisations or individuals might feel that their company is more prepared than others? What do you think they could be doing or thinking of that other people aren't?
Well, it's difficult to imagine fully why people answered one way or another, but there could be several hypotheses if you want. I would say that it also depends. I would say that first, those who feel fully prepared probably have well understood that the key concept of the EUDR is not going to change. So the due diligence concept is really, so the core of the regulation, if you want, is the same. It's practicing due diligence through a risk-based approach, so assessing the risks in your supply chain and mitigating the risks wherever you find them. And this core is not going to change. So that's one good thing that the timber sector already has been practicing for decades, like setting up their systems, writing down procedures, testing the systems, engaging with their suppliers, because a key element of all this is to create this ecosystem with your suppliers where they understand why they need to provide you information, so you can in turn, as an operator, do your due diligence and have confidence on your products, and that there's no risk attached to those timber products. So I would say that this is some reassuring part for the sector, and I would understand, like based from this, that yes, it's easy to feel prepared. On the other hand, as Ollie said, those who might have answered less prepared might have also understood that some new elements might have like kind of a deep impact. So the geolocation is going to change a lot of things for sure. We can also think of the forest degradation bit that was not there yet. The definition of legality might also evolve a little bit. So we don't know yet how far-reaching these are going to be and how deep an impact they will have on timber companies. And the last thing I'm thinking of is might depend also on the nature of the business. Importers that import like some timbers and relatively simpler products, they're kind of practicing this due diligence for years, and they have shorter supply chains, more easy to understand. More complex products, so composite products and very long supply chains, operators still today are struggling with the current EUDR, right? So that might also explain why they would say they're not feeling fully prepared for even more traceability, because they are still struggling today with their current requirements. So those are the few, hypotheses that we could think of.
And is there any advice that you or that Oliver might have for organisations in the timber value chain or other value chains, what they can do to feel more prepared or be more prepared for incoming regulation?
Sure. Maybe I can say a few words first. I would say the first thing would be to keep being informed. Read those drafts that have been published by now the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission. They're not so long; they're quite easy to read. So that's a good first step into getting to understand what are the likely changes. Kind of picture what the likely new elements are going to mean for your business. So the geolocation one is very likely to stay. So you can start thinking about how you're going to handle that depending on the size of your activity, the product you're importing, etc. I would say a third thing would be to keep engaging with suppliers. That has been a very important thing with the EUDR, and this is very key to meeting the requirements, is really to engage your suppliers and build kind of supplier ecosystem where there's trust, information sharing, and a stable environment that enables all operators to get the information in time and the information they need. So this can be done in advance. You don't have to wait for the regulation to come in place to kind of start having this discussion with your suppliers that you might need more things from them and explaining why. And the last thing, but maybe we'll touch upon it in the second deep dive, would be to kind of keep improving digital systems to manage our information, because we're seeing so much struggle in that area. And that also can be a good anticipation for companies. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Cool. And just before we move on to the second deep dive, I don't know, Oliver, if there's anything you'd want to add about general sentiment or feelings, or what companies can do to feel prepared, or we can just move on. Up to you.
Yeah, I would maybe just echo some of those points of there's a lot that you can do ahead of knowing the final detail of this, that Chloe was pointing out there. So collaborating with competitors or other organizations in the sector to find out how they're doing issues, learn from others. Trade associations do an awful lot, a lot of the time, to align due diligence frameworks for all members ahead of regulations coming into force. So talking to those kind of experts, and there's a number of other service providers, NGOs, support organizations out there that can help organizations support and understand particular issues. And I think a lot of that is understanding where the general kind of all observers really don't have clarity yet, and where you can have clarity just with a few conversations to understand the meaning of certain pieces of the legislation. But yeah, I'd say certainly that exchange as early as possible, identifying the gaps, whether that's in supply chain mapping, traceability, engaging with suppliers in countries that are not typically used to providing transparency on supply chains, starting with those tricky supply chains to have those conversations around what is the need and why are you asking for this information. That will all set you in good stead for when you actually need to get to the risk assessment component.
Perfect, thank you. So we will pivot slightly, or rather build upon that discussion and look at the concept of traceability and how it applies to all of the organizations that we represent, and those joining this call. So we'll look at what do we mean by traceability, how does it relate to the regulation, and what is the general sentiment, positive and negative, about traceability solutions for the attendees. So perhaps sticking with you for a moment longer, Ollie, if that's okay. What do we mean by traceability, and what's the link between it and incoming regulation?
Yeah. So I guess traceability, supply chain mapping, transparency as terms get kind of used interchangeably a lot of the time. So I think firstly it's important to know the difference between those different concepts. A lot of the time within EUDR and what we will be doing under EUDR, the important first step is actually knowing the companies in the supply chain, so supply chain mapping, and that you can do a lot in terms of risk assessment there before you've even got to tracing actual product through supply chains. And that is really the change from supply chain mapping, knowing the companies, to traceability of knowing the flow of products through a supply chain. And the volumes and where those particular products are coming from. So which countries they're coming from, how much is coming from there, which particular companies they're flowing through, and right back to farm level traceability if that's needed and required. So traceability can kind of differ through a supply chain. You could have traceability to a mill level. You could have traceability right to a farm level. So there's varying levels of traceability that you can have. And then transparency as a broader concept really, to me, just means that access to information and making information available to others. So as a supplier, I could make that information available to you directly by providing you policies that I have in place for forest management, or I could publish those online. So a lot of the time you need that transparency as an enabling environment and framework to facilitate supply chain mapping and traceability as part of risk assessment. And I think when we get to the aspect of traceability, that's I guess the most tricky issue, because that's the most specific that we're trying to be, is tie products and volumes to particular supply chains, especially in the regulation, trying to feed that back to a particular plot or concession area. And I think, Chloe, you can probably speak more to what's actually required in the regulation in terms of the terminology around traceability or lack thereof.
Yeah, I can add a few words to that. The first thing that comes to my mind, it's very interesting to notice that in the current EUDR and the upcoming one, so the draft version we've all seen, it's not, traceability is not mentioned as such. Even supply chain mapping, I don't think it comes up. It's more through the angle of information requirement, right? So, so right now, as it is right now, there's the information requirement that you need to know the country of origin at the very minimum. But to do that, it's kind of the next, like the underlying step, that to know that you have to do this exercise of supply chain mapping and transparency, because your suppliers, if it's a quite long supply chain, they'll need to share this information down the line so you can identify the country of harvest and then in turn do some risk assessment. And I believe in the upcoming version, it's still the same approach. It's more like an information requirement. So you need to collect information on your products. And in the list of mandatory requirements, then there is this requirement of geolocation of all plots of land where the product has been produced. And I believe there's also, I cannot remember exactly how it's phrased, but it's tied to a time frame. So it's also, it has to correspond to a time of harvest or production for agricultural commodity. So it's quite very, very, much more precise and detailed than what we had so far. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, both of you. So I'll share just very briefly the high-level results when asked, is your organization keen to use a traceability solution? And apologies that it's a little bit cut off at the bottom here. But you can see that 42% of all 252 respondents said that they were keen, they agreed that they were keen to use a traceability solution. That was as high as 52% in Italy and 51% in the UK. 31%, so just under a third, were neutral. And 25% disagreed. They weren't keen to use a traceability solution, which was as high as 34% in France and Austria. Now, this isn't, the data here doesn't indicate good or bad, or that some organizations are doing really well and others are more closed off to this. It could be that organizations are already have really solid and strong traceability solutions, so they don't feel the need to add more just now. I think the more interesting thing to look at is why. So why would an organization be keen? But also, what are some of the challenges and what are the barriers to adoption? So this is where I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and hope that it works, because this is the audience participation bit. So for the 60 odd people who are on the call, I would love in the chat box if you could share what are the barriers for you, or what are some of the concerns you would have around traceability solutions. So if you type that into the chat box on the bottom right, we'll see how many responses we get and see if we can pull a word cloud together. So I'll just give you 20 seconds or so to do that. Maybe there's some, actually a real range there, but maybe not quite enough for a word cloud. So we can maybe address these points in a moment. I'll give the panel a moment just to think about these, and we'll come on to the barriers. But just before we do that, to share what some of the benefits were that the importers we surveyed said that they felt existed when it came to traceability solutions. So the way that this slide works is, let's take the top left one. 43% of all organizations surveyed said that a full traceability solution would enable organizations to grow positively. And then we've tried to do a bit of a heat map. So the UK, it was as high as 56% of organizations felt this, agreed with it, and only 24% of organizations in Austria. So I think the two that are the most interesting here from my perspective are the 50% and the 43% in the bottom row. And they're sort of saying the same thing, right? So 50% of organizations and as many as 67% in the UK said sourcing timber would be easier with a traceability solution. Market access or identification of supply and helping and gaining access to compliant timber would be easier if there was traceability solutions in place here. So they're the benefits. If we move on to what the survey respondents said were their concerns, we'll then compare this to your concerns overall. The one that I think is actually quite encouraging here is the middle one on the top row, 48%. So almost half of all of the respondents said that more traceability might expose gaps or problems within their supply chain, as high as 58% in Italy and France, 54% that they said that they were unconcerned with this as a problem. So the reason why I think this is encouraging is good organizations want to be aware of their supply chain. They want to know where there might be gaps or problems and work to solve them. And this is exactly what the regulation is trying to do and exactly what traceability solutions are trying to help with. They're trying to create much more certainty and assurance around supply chains. Going back to the supply chain mapping that Chloe mentioned. So can I pass it over to perhaps Chloe and Oliver and David, just if you have any thoughts on any of the comments from those who are attending the webinar today that are in the right-hand side. Does anything jump out? Is there anything that you think people aren't worried enough about, or anything that you think actually there are some good answers to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely justified of the worry about getting enough information from suppliers, and that's reflected in the percentage that you cited there around with more traceability, you will probably find gaps in supply chains, and that's usually what you find through the whole risk assessment process. After doing EUDR due diligence for a few years, you increase the amount of information available in your supply chains. You can start to look at that information over time and see where documents are being reused. You start to get a sense of where information looks incorrect over time from just going through that process. But it's all dependent on suppliers making that information available. So I think that's also part of what the new regulation is trying to tackle, is really try to move buyers away from just relying on supply chain documentation and then being able to make a general risk assessment of legality at the forest level, to actually, where there's a very blunt instrument, having to have identification of plot level in all cases, and then being able to monitor deforestation at that level, will force supply chains to become more transparent, I think, is the aim of the regulation, at least. If not, we may see whether or not that actually happens, but that's certainly the aim of the regulation, I think, to try and tackle some of the issues that we have seen under the EUDR.
I was going to say the exact same thing. We're all aware that it's a challenge, but I do think that the objective of those regulations is not to continue with business as usual, right? It's to change the way we do things for the better. And so engaging with suppliers and kind of overcoming this reluctance and build more stable supply chains where suppliers can trust you and you can trust them. I think that's kind of the hidden objective of the regulation, right? So I'm not saying it's easy. And I know it's a very challenging process to go to, but I think we have seen progresses over the last 10 years now. suppliers are sharing their own sub-suppliers information way more easily, not always, but more easily. They're even providing invoices to be like kind of supporting a document to evidence supply chains. There has been in a decade tremendous progress in opening up and suppliers being more transparent. So that can only continue to happen. It will be a long process, but it will happen. And also the second thing is I often hear partners telling me that yes, it's very challenging, but the most efficient rationale behind asking your supplier for more transparency is telling them, look, it's a requirement for me. If I don't have this information, I can be sanctioned, right? There's fines that could be hanging over my head. This is the regulatory framework I'm under. I have no control over it. So that's why I'm asking you this information, not just because I want to and it's pleasing me or it's my own policy. So I think it's a challenging, but the fact that it's a regulation with sanctions attached, even if it's not so strictly applied, the sanctioning regime, but it's still a very powerful rationale to engage with supplier and to tell them, look, this is how I have to do it. Otherwise, I'm just outside of legality. So that's we need to find ways to work together. So yeah, not easy, but
And I suppose, Chloe, the other side of what you said is, as a supplier, if I am able to share the level of documentation, the level of due diligence that my customers need, it could become a differentiator or a unique value-adding service that you're offering for people. There's a point made by Sarah about the building upon that 48% of people being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data. Sarah says it's especially overwhelming if you're a retailer with a wide range of products. And I think this also links into one of the questions we had shared in advance around if you've got highly complex, highly processed goods that involve a lot of mixing. So I think we'll come on to that. David, I'm wondering if I can go to you, because there are quite a few points here around data security, reliability of the information, and transparency here. Is there anything based on the work that you've been doing that you'd want to raise around these points?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a technologist, these are the kind of problems that we enjoy because actually when you're talking about data, and whether that be data volume, data security, data sharing, this is where technology can come into its own. Technology is not a silver bullet, but it can provide tools which can help with these sort of things. So when you think of volume of data, and a technologist's mind would go immediately to some of the things that are happening in AI and machine learning, which are used in the financial industry, for example, to identify fraud and dealing with big data. Can those sort of things, technologies, be applied to traceability and supply chains? I would say yes, as a technologist. So actually, the more data, the better for those things. But then how do we address the issues around concerns about data security, data sensitivity, all this kind of thing? And this is where technology can help, providing guarantees around integrity of the data, being able to give suppliers control over what data is shared, so they can redact the commercially sensitive information and share the relevant information, yet still maintain the trust. And this is some of the things that we're doing. That, as I said, technology is a tool there. What needs to be understood around that is what is the real key data that needs to be shared, and what data is it okay to redact and maintain the privacy of, or can I share that data with the relevant party, such as a preferred by nature, but not necessarily to my customer because it's commercially sensitive. So these are all the sort of questions that are actually excite us as technologists, because we want to bring what we know around technology to bear on these problems and work through with the industries to find solutions using the technology. So, yeah.
And perhaps going back to you, Chloe, can you talk to us about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what you see when it comes to organizations trying to elevate their levels of traceability? Because I'm sure you see the whole spectrum.
Yeah, sure. And even, I would say traceability in the larger sense, like encompassing supply chain mapping, because that's really where most companies are right now as their requirements. I don't think there's a lot that are engaging into traceability. starting, but it's quite slow. So within the broader realm of traceability and supply chain mapping, we do see so many different. I would start by the worst. To me, the worst that I've seen is a very neatly organized systems but like no dedicated system. So only folders and subfolders and subfolders within a cloud-based system with documents or PDF and scans and photos stored under each folder on a shipment basis. So it was in a way quite well organized, but in a way that totally prevented any kind of cross-analysis to happen. So there was supply chain document within each subfolders in a way that was impossible to have an overview about the whole supply chains, whether the documents submitted were the same over time, over a certain period of time, or whether they were changing. It was kind of limiting any kind of analysis, despite it being very nicely organized. So to me, that's kind of the worst thing, is like thinking of a way to clean your information, but making it impossible to kind of have some analysis out of it. And I would say, so there's this, and then there's companies, I would say dedicated digital systems are the best, because you can design them in a way that fits the information that you want to manage. And supply chain information is complex. It's kind of in a network form, right? You have products that are linked to supply chain, that are linked to suppliers, and this is all kind of in a web form. It's like everything can be connected or not. So Excel tables, they can help. They're good tools, they're cheap, but they're not specifically designed with columns and rows to kind of illustrate this networked information. So I would say in the best practices that we see, we've seen companies using and engaging with dedicated digital system, which helps a lot to visualize your supply chains, to have this kind of high level information, to prioritize the risk mitigation you want to conduct depending on the volumes that you've been sourcing, and to have kind of, yes, out of this pool, this lake of data, make some sense out of it, so your action can actually be focused on where you need to act first. So I would say we're seeing that, and then a little bit of everything in between. And we're starting to see some engaging with traceability, so mapping the whole flows of volumes, and that's an exciting area that we're following up on.
And maybe for you, Ollie, a question. If an organization wanted to evolve from that supply chain mapping that Chloe described to a more comprehensive traceability system, what would you say the first steps are that they should take? Because you can't go from 0 to 100 with this. It's complex, it takes time. But what do you think are the basics that people should think about first?
Yeah, I think it's partly what I mentioned before of mapping out what information you do have available first, finding out, doing exactly what Chloe was saying there, is not doing document sorting for the sake of it, but actually using that to identify where you have gaps and to facilitate a risk assessment. So the aim should not be to create a very well set out set of documents, but to actually identify where do I need more information from my supply chains, which suppliers are not particularly compliant and are not providing the information that I'm going to need, because if they're not going to provide that information now, are they going to provide that in future? If not, and if those relationships aren't strong enough to gain access to information, that's probably going to mean that you're never going to be able to conclude negligible risk for some supply chains. So there's also some difficult discussions and thoughts here to have around what is going to be viable for this regulation going forward. And I think that also is the case for the comment from Sarah on just the sheer volume and the complexity of supply chains and information that you get. And I think, again, an implicit kind of aim of this regulation is probably to try to ensure that there is less complexity in supply chains, so that they don't continue in some cases to be so impenetrable that you can never assess whether risk is negligible or not. And I think what we see a lot of the time is in supply chain information that seems to be constantly changing, and suppliers just provide new documentation when you query a risk around one aspect. A lot of the time, illegality and deforestation issues can hide in that complexity. And I think that's also the case for when we're thinking about very long supply chains, very complex supply chains like board products like rubber, like palm oil? Is the complexity there adding to the complexity of a supply chain to a level that will preclude concluding low risk in the long term? But also, I think we shouldn't just try to simplify supply chains for the sake of it. And I think in a lot of these issues, we've got to consider the impacts on livelihoods as well as on deforestation and on illegalities in supply chains. If we look at a lot of smallholder timber production, if we look at sectors like palm oil and rubber that are very led by smallholders, I think in the rubber sector it's something like 60%, and in the rubber sector 85% of global production is from smallholders. That's where these geolocation issues and traceability issues are going to be most complex. And we need there to be a certain amount of consolidation of changing in supply chains, actual intervention to cut out middlemen where that's not adding value to supply chains and they're taking out the profits that should be going to smallholders, but also making sure that smallholders themselves are supported and not excluded from European markets by this legislation. And that's certainly something that in the last round of consultation was heard very strongly by the European institutions, that this is a very real danger, that smallholders could just be moved away from by European buyers because it's easier to buy from a large scale concession. So I think that needs to be in place, and there needs to be a stronger position from the EU on financing some of the countries through bilateral mechanisms like we saw with the FLEG VPA process. For all its failings and problems, I think a lot of progress was made, especially with smallholder stakeholders in a lot of countries, and that complemented the demand side measures that were brought in with the EU timber regulation. So you have to give support to countries that are producing and smallholders in those countries, as well as just asking large businesses to do due diligence and risk assessment to ensure that the trade doesn't just move to large scale concession production.
Yeah, 100%. I think we'd agree with you there. I want to leave enough time for the questions that we've had in advance, but David, maybe passing over to you from the technology standpoint, or looking at market solutions, what are some of the common challenges that we've heard about today that technology could help with, but what are some of the problems that are still yet to be solved?
Yeah, I'll try and... There's still a lot of problems. So I'll try and whiz through these quite quickly. And some have been touched on by some of the questions and points we've seen raised in chat. But it's a really important one that Ollie just mentioned about smallholders. And the big question for technology companies like us who are building solutions is who pays to use our solutions. How do the smallholders engage with the digital solution if the cost is prohibitive? The cost of development is prohibitive. These are challenges that we face and we're trying to address. But they're real. Governance is a really big thing. Chloe mentioned that it's a network. It's not just a single nicely drawn supply chain. And so the governance around how data can flow and moves around and who owns it and how all these kind of things is really the market needs to define the rules of engagement. As technology companies, we can help, we can suggest, we can facilitate, we can do all those things, but really, for the market to be efficient, for these traceabilities to really work amongst multiple organizations, there needs to be protocols developed and governance around that. Morley mentioned about the fear of sharing data, and we're trying to come up with solutions to help with that, help people share enough data. Again, that needs to be defined, what's enough, but also not too much data to help allay their concerns there. There's a big one, which is the complex supply chains where you get mixing. Not all approaches will work with mixing. Again, technology can help, and we're even talking about technology like isotope analysis and these kind of scientific approaches which can help where mixing is occurring. But it's still a challenge there. There's a challenge around the economics, as well as the sort of integration with traceability. Just generally, infrastructure, digital infrastructure is not ubiquitous. It is not across all geographies. So solutions and systems we come up with have to take this into account. They have to be able to accommodate locations where the infrastructure isn't, all there. So these are just some of the challenges. And I think another really big one, so the EUDR is the EU, and they're putting out this legislation. Again, the geographies are all very different. Local governments buy in and local people buy into this, isn't guaranteed, and it will be a process and a time. They need to see the value as well. And unfortunately, there's the attitudes to fraudulent activity are very different between the regions as well. So this isn't going to be a quick fix. That will apply everywhere. It's going to be a journey, and it will be a differing rate of adoption in different regions, definitely. But for us, it's about let's try and make things easier and more efficient for the good actors, and let's try and make things harder for the bad actors. And so that's where we think technology can help.
Thank you. I'm going to move on the remaining 8 minutes to questions, and I think we've got 5 or 6, which is a really nice amount. I'm going to prioritize them based upon who asked questions in advance, who's actually on the call, and maybe we can do a bit of a rapid fire round. So the first question is from Matteo from FSC in Brussels, and the question was, EUDR will accommodate different commodities. Is there any differences in ensuring traceabilities among the commodities? So I think that's probably one for Chloe or for Ollie.
Sure, yeah. I can say a few words on that. I would say yes, there will be practical differences, but also not necessarily in terms of only the commodities, but in the product too, right? So tracing some timber is very different from tracing paper products in the end. So it's more, and I would say that there could be some nice lesson learned and share of practices across those commodities. Right now, the systems are, as far as I see it, they're working kind of in silos with their own certification schemes and their own reflection on traceability. So maybe the fact that there's a common regulation going that will be adopted soon will kind of help kind of share the good practices across commodities. And I do see a lot of different but common processing steps across those commodities. So yeah, maybe the cocoa sector can teach some good practices to, I don't know, the paper sector or palm oil. Palm oil is also a bit different. So the steps are a bit different, but I see some products with high level of mixing happening. They have some common ground. There's this smallholder issue Ollie has mentioned. So I think that there is room for sharing across those commodities in how to comply with this regulation, where the requirement is the same for every commodity. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, and I'd maybe just add to that. I think this is where, if you're buying different commodities, you really need to understand the commodity itself, because that can impact the complexity of the supply chain and the level of mixing. If we're looking at something like palm oil, now there's a universal mill list that's available for Indonesia, at least, covering all the palm oil mills. And essentially, because palm oil is a perishable product, it's a fruit, you can draw a circle around a palm oil mill and know that your palm oil is coming from a certain distance from around that mill, and that's dependent on just the time that you need to get that fruit to the processing facility before it's not viable anymore. You've got a similar situation with rubber, but it's a non-perishable product, so that can be transported much further, and therefore the level of mixing that could occur within those areas is potentially going to be different. Probably it can be transported much further to a mill and still be economically viable. But I think there's a need to understand what is that maximum economic haulage distance, and can you infer distance and then location of supplies from the information in your supply chain on issues like that.
Fantastic. And if it's okay, I can share contact details for Chloe and Ollie with everyone on this call if people want to follow up on the questions. I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 more, so a minute each. Jens Ulrich from International Timber asked a question that showed he'd read the report in detail, because he commented on the fact that it was really worrying that 83% of all of the respondents spent more than half of their working time digging around for documentation. It's not productive, etc., etc. So I wondered, Ollie, if you had any reflections or any thoughts on that comment from Jens Ulrich.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with the main ethos of that comment, that we don't want to be spending time just shuffling papers, finding information. You really want to have a lean process so that you can risk assess quickly and spend most of the sustainability budget and your time as sustainability managers on tackling the issues, on mitigating risk at the forest level. And that's where you can start to work with smallholders and those kind of issues, and actually make sure that the money is being spent on keeping forests standing rather than just evaluation. I think the other thing that highlights is, if you're constantly trying to find information, historic information on supply chains because you're being audited by a competent authority, then that also indicates that your risk assessment is probably not very robust over time. If you're sourcing from the same supplier, you need to be looking at, am I just being provided the same package of supply chain documentation and it's just getting older and older, and how likely is that to still be relevant to my products that I'm sourcing? Should I be expecting new forest harvest permits, new transportation licenses? What is how feasible is it that this timber has been in storage for this long because I was given the same information at a previous order? That kind of stuff. If you're not analyzing that, then it also shows that your risk assessment is probably a bit weak over time.
Great, thank you. Chloe, maybe one for you. Robin, who I think is also on the call from Earthworm Foundation, asks about the level of traceability that companies using end products such as cardboard boxes need. And my understanding is that as derived products, if they are being imported in that end product form into the EU, then they have to satisfy exactly the same traceability requirements. But maybe you can shed some light on that.
Sure. If the question is about the scope of the regulation, right now we don't foresee, we don't know, but the timber sector scope might not change, which is weird because there's been some discussion over time around the scope of the EUDR, and I think a lot of stakeholders are pushing for a change and more comprehensive scope of product that are concerned. So card boxes, you mentioned, they're only covered if they're imported as the product. So if you're buying is the cardboard, not if you're buying the product that's within the card box. I don't know if that's where the question is going. So I guess we'll have to wait and see the exact scope, which is, as a reminder, the HS, so the custom codes is, the full list is annexed to the regulation. And if your product is imported under one of those custom codes, then it's under the due diligence requirement, and if not, then it's not. Yeah, I don't know. This question could also be about the nature of the product itself, right? Because, as we said, paper products, board products, those are highly complex products. So I don't know if that's where this question was going or not, which is a whole other area to explore in terms of traceability. But I think we've touched upon it, so I hope it's been addressed.
There are a few questions I think we've run out of time for, but I will try and coordinate a response to the individuals who asked them from the panelists today. Just to wrap up, these are the contact details if you want any more information from those who joined. What I would say is thank you very, very much for starting this dialogue. I think Chloe called it out early on, and Ollie repeated it, that it's to make this work, it's going to be all about creating an ecosystem and keeping more informed and learning from different parts of the supply chain. So we're hopeful that this is just the start of the discussion, and as the regulation becomes clearer, as things evolve, we can hopefully keep you all in touch. Please let us know any feedback. Was it useful? Was it not so useful? How could we have made it more useful for you overall? I will share the recording of this video for you. And yeah, I hope it was very helpful. Thank you hugely to Chloe, Ollie and David as well for joining. I learned a lot from the conversation, so hopefully other people did too. And I think that is it, everyone. So thank you ever so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.